Why Europe doesn't build skyscrapers. When you think of the trappings of a developed settlement, you're probably thinking about things like awesome monuments, busy streets, and yes, skyscrapers. Seeing a city with skyscrapers clustering in and around it is pretty much one of the major signs that it is developed and that stuff is booming there. But here's the thing though, you might not know this, but most of the skyscrapers you see today are actually concentrated in cities across Asia and North America. What on earth happened to Europe? Despite easily being one of the most economically and technologically advanced continents on the planet, Europe actually doesn't have so many skyscrapers. Besides a few cities like London, Istanbul, and Paris, there really aren't so many high-rise buildings across the continent. And the reason for that is actually pretty interesting. In this video, we'll shed some light into one of the most treasured architectural secrets of the European continent. What really is a skyscraper? Now, before we even begin, I think it's important to consider what type of building can even be called a skyscraper. I know it's easy to just look at a tall building and label it a skyscraper, but some of the buildings you see might not actually qualify. To be fair, there really is no universally accepted set of criteria that define what a skyscraper is. Sure, it's got to be a tall building, but for most of these buildings, there are some minimal requirements that we've kind of come to accept over the years. For instance, any building looking to be considered a skyscraper would need to be at least 150 meters or 492 feet tall. Some say that 100 meters in height is fine, but most people agree that your building would need to cross the 150 meter mark to be a skyscraper. With such a height, a regular skyscraper would need to also have about 40 to 50 floors on it, and this number has also been subject to change over the years. Back in the day, any building with at least 10 stories would easily have passed for a skyscraper. But with advancements in construction these days, 10 stories is child's play. Now, if you check the list of cities in the world with the most skyscrapers, you really wouldn't be surprised at what you see. Shanghai, New York, Hong Kong, Dubai, and the like. But if you zoom out and check the top 100 cities, you see something interesting. There are only 5 European cities. These are London, Istanbul, Moscow, Paris, and Frankfurt. And if you check the top 30, there's still not a single European city in there. Over the years, skyscrapers have kind of become a symbol of a country's strength and financial might. But when you consider the fact that Moscow and Istanbul, the capital cities of Russia and Turkey respectively, have the most skyscrapers in Europe, you kind of see that this symbolism doesn't necessarily hold in Europe. I mean, no offense to Russia and Turkey, but they're not particularly known to be economic powerhouses. On the flip side, London is easily seen by many as the world's financial capital, next to New York City. But even with that, the city just doesn't have as many skyscrapers as your average American city. Europe's architectural history. Easily the biggest reason why there aren't so many skyscrapers in Europe is the continent's architectural heritage itself. You see, for most other continents, the development of their architecture came in relatively modern times. Many of the Middle Eastern and Asian cities really only got developed in the past 100 years or so, while North American cities had their start a little earlier. For the Europeans, however, you get a little sense of history with their architecture. Many of these buildings were built thousands of years ago, in a time when churches and other religious and political buildings were the highest in the cities. The city skylines were dominated by many of these buildings, and while they might not seem so tall today, they were definitely the toasts of their age. Today, you can easily find several buildings in Europe, whether residential or commercial, that are older than the United States of America itself. And many of these settlements have been built in such a way that you only have one major monument standing tall: the Tower of London, the Tower Bridge, the Eiffel Tower, etc. All of these monuments have become synonymous with the architecture of these buildings themselves and pretty much dominate the city skylines. So, there are strict laws in many of these cities that prevent the erection of a building that would essentially threaten the dominance of these major monuments. Think about it like this. If the Statue of Liberty had been built thousands of years ago and had an extended history, would the US government really want any other building to be built so close to it that it essentially steals the statue's shine? Of course not. So, you kind of see why many of these cities just have low to medium-rise buildings that stand on their own. Maintaining the view. The next reason why there aren't so many skyscrapers in Europe is kind of related to the first one, and it considers the looks of many of Europe's prominent buildings and sites, as well as the government's need to preserve them. Take the city of Lisbon, Portugal, for instance. One of the most popular parks in the city is the Parque Eduardo VII, a park that was commissioned back in 1903. If you stand at a certain point here, it's possible for you to see the entire park, as well as the nearby river and a clear shot of the city. If you suddenly throw in a bunch of 150-meter buildings around the region, you kind of ruin the view. The same holds for cities like London. A building like St. Paul's Cathedral can easily be seen over a long distance, even as far away as Alexandra Palace. And for buildings that are around this monument, the fact that people get a clear sight of the cathedral is one of their selling points. Paris, Geneva, and many more European countries have a similar trend. Many of these cities have just one or two monuments that tower over the rest. And that's not entirely by accident. These monuments are major tourist attractions, and one of the reasons why they are so popular is because they provide impressive views. Destroy those views with monstrous buildings, and you pretty much spoil the fun for everyone. Structural and ecological differences. Moving on, we also need to point out the fact that a lot of these European cities just don't have the structural might to hold skyscrapers. As we explained earlier, many of these cities have been in existence long before the United States. And when the construction of the US was being done, skyscrapers were part of the plan. Same with many other cities in Asia, North America, and the Middle East that were developed within the past century or so. For Europe, you see a lot of clustered, tight settlements where skyscrapers just can't fit. To build a skyscraper in many of these cities, you'd need to tear down a lot of existing buildings already, and that won't necessarily go down well with the locals. The crazy thing about this whole scheme is that it's not just the governments that are against any new buildings vying for space with their cherished monuments. Even the locals aren't necessarily fans of high-rise buildings. I mean, if you've lived in a place all your life and suddenly some company comes and starts breaking stuff, you'd probably feel a certain type of way about it as well. We saw a perfect example of this back in the 60s. The government of Belgium allowed the demolition of several ancient buildings and monuments in Brussels, making way for the erection of large skyscrapers as part of Brussels Expo. The term was even called Brusselization, and it's been used to describe the phenomenon of building skyscrapers indiscriminately throughout a city. The people of Brussels hated this, and they quickly stood up against it. Soon enough, the trend toward high-rise buildings was stopped, and the city had to implement proper zoning. In Paris, there really is one building that has kind of become the poster child for skyscrapers, the Tour Montparnasse. Standing at 210 meters in length, the Tour Montparnasse is the tallest building within Paris's city limits. And it's been the subject of a lot of hate and derision over the past few years because it kind of sticks out in the city. And many Parisians don't necessarily like the fact that it kind of competes for attention with the Eiffel Tower. To make up for this, the French authorities eventually designated a small patch of land outside of Paris's city limits where the city's financial district is located. This area has its fair share of high-rise buildings, but it is considered far enough away from Paris that it doesn't necessarily ruin the city's beautiful and lush views. Europeans are known for generally having a simpler life, and in many ways, this also extends to their buildings. Whether due to the government's desire to maintain cities' architectural heritage or the fact that the people themselves aren't necessarily so into skyscrapers, it appears that these massive buildings just aren't meant for the continent. What do you think, though? Would Europe's skylines and landscapes be better with skyscrapers? Let us know in the comments.